Hi, welcome to this lecture on Paul Rabinow's Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco. We've looked at the basics of what fieldworkers do, and we've noted the importance of relationships to this endeavor. In this lecture, we're going to concentrate more on that and how complicated this can get by focusing on Rabinow's book. In this book, Rabinow is interested in two things. First is the experience of fieldwork as a cultural practice in and of itself. But this time, the tribe, so to speak, is cultural anthropologists. He wants to know how we are to understand ethnographic fieldwork as a cultural practice that cultural anthropologists engage in. Second, Rabinow is very interested in the mutuality of the fieldwork relationship. That is, how it affects those being studied as well as the cultural anthropologists and their knowledge. What kind of dilemmas arise in the field due to the fact that those being studied are people with their own agendas, ideas, idiosyncrasies, and personalities? Let's start with a point that I made a couple of sessions ago when we talked about how fieldwork has changed over time. As Rabinow puts it on page 5, fieldwork and theory are intimately related. He argues against the perspective that the field experience or fieldwork itself is basically separable or separate from the mainstream of theory in anthropology, that the enterprise of inquiry is essentially discontinuous from its results. For Rabinow, fieldwork and the results and theory that flow from fieldwork are linked. As mentioned, we have talked about a link between theory and ethnography a bit. This is when we talked about the traditional billiard ball notion of culture, which shaped how and where fieldwork happened, and we spoke about the rejection of that idea in favor of a more networked idea of culture as historical and interconnected, which has made multi-sited fieldwork much more common. Sometimes the link between theory and method involves the fact that the issue we ultimately end up writing about isn't the same as the one we initially entered the field to study. Think about how Napoleon Chagnon's research problem emerged in the reading about the Yanomamo. The issue of village fissioning or splitting was only discovered as important while he was in the field. Sometimes what anthropologists think is important is not, or something more interesting that they didn't know about before entering the field is happening. Moreover, what we look at is driven by the substance of theory when we're in the field. If we have a materialist outlook of one type or another, if we're interested in material factors, we'll make sure to pay close attention to the workings of the economic and political system. If we study religion or magic, for example, we'll pay attention to the economic status of shamans and their patrons, flows of money to them, and so on. Other theoretical perspectives will look at this differently. For instance, structuralists, like the famous anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who were interested in the structures of thought that a culture showed, will focus on the ideas of a shaman or religious figure. Rabinow goes on to say, at the risk of violating the clan taboos, I argue that all cultural activity is experiential, that fieldwork is a distinctive type of cultural activity, and that it is this activity which defines the discipline. While some disagree, this is the majority in position in anthropology, whether anthropologists make it explicit or not. Fieldwork is the rite of passage that marks you as a member of the quote-unquote clan of anthropologists or the tribe of anthropologists. It is also the key practice of gathering knowledge that's then systematized into theory. So then Rabinow asks a question that at the point that this book was written, in the late 1960s, hadn't really been addressed in public by many anthropologists. What actually happens during fieldwork? What happens in the field? We've talked a bit about this, but Rabinow makes things very detailed and a bit more complicated. Indeed, here's how Rabinow defines fieldwork on page 155. A process of intersubjective construction of liminal modes of communication. Right now, you're probably thinking, yikes, what the heck does that mean? Well, let's see if we can figure that out by going through the book and the different anecdotes that Rabinow lays out and analyzes from his fieldwork. Here's a list of those anecdotes. We'll go through them one by one and unpack them, just as I asked you to do with one of them for the discussion prompt for this module. Let's start with Rabinow's initial encounter with Maurice Richards. This shows the self-consciousness of the fieldworker and the importance of fieldwork as a rite of passage. While in the field, Rabinow feels that Richards is not different enough from him to make a good informant. It seems too easy. In retrospect, Rabinow realizes that Richards' position as an outsider straddling two cultures, Moroccan and French, and the fact that he and Richards had enough in common to communicate and relate easily would in fact have made him a very good informant. In fact, he realizes this is an ideal anthropological situation, but only in retrospect. At the time, while he's in the field, he feels like anthropology should be about finding difference, and Richard just isn't different enough. In Ibrahim, Rabinow finds cultural difference, but maybe too much. Ibrahim and Rabinow basically treat each other as resources, with each getting what they want from the other. Rabinow gets knowledge, Ibrahim gets money. But ultimately, the data Rabinow gets is limited. He says Ibrahim packages Moroccan culture for him, like a tourist brochure. He says on page 27 that he gets only surfaces and packaged facets. Ibrahim resists any further penetration into his world, rebuffing Rabinow's attempt to get deeper. Instead, as the episode with the forgotten wallet shows, there's a lot going on with Ibrahim that Rabinow has no idea of. And this makes for an encounter with profound cultural difference that Rabinow actually finds upsetting. It brings to light what Rabinow calls the thinness of the common sense shared by the two men. And it makes clear the importance of thickening this shared common sense if fieldwork is to be productive. The next few anecdotes all involve Ali. We'll start with Rabinow's identification of a curing practice that Ali performs. Here, Rabinow encounters profound cultural difference and someone who is willing to share its meaning with him. What's really important here is what happens to Ali when he reflects upon the practice for Rabinow. He is forced to objectify his own culture, that is, to treat it like an object of understanding and scrutiny in a way that he hasn't before. This makes him aware of it in a new way. Thus, we see how fieldwork is a two-way street. It changes the informant and the anthropologist. The anthropologist is not studying the culture from a distance. Rather, this is a dialogue, a back and forth between fieldworker and informant. Next, we have Ali's relationship to his own community. Here we see how certain people make good informants. In this case, Ali is a marginal character in his own community. He's a pimp, and he's someone who doesn't really follow the rules. This gives him some perspective that others might lack. He's an outsider, someone who has consciously rejected the mainstream way of life. Unlike those invested in that way of life, he has the ability and the willingness to look at it carefully, warts and all. But on the downside, working with Ali might make Rabinow suspicious in other people's eyes. Let's turn now to the trip that Rabinow takes to a wedding with Ali. This is an episode in this book that students always enjoy. Ali tests Rabinow and forces him to treat Ali like he would a regular person. When treated badly by Ali, Rabinow gets angry at him. That is to say, he shows he takes their relationship seriously enough to get mad about it, even to the point where he thinks he might have jeopardized the fieldworker-informant relationship. But what actually happens, contrary to Rabinow's expectations, is this encounter makes Ali an even better informant. Their relationship is strengthened by the fight the two have, and this improves the quality of the information Ali provides him. Anger actually builds trust. Let's turn to Rabinow's encounter with the gendarme, or the police officer. Here's some of the ethical issues with fieldwork emerge. Rather than being accepted with open arms, Rabinow is rebuffed from studying the village. Rather than just let things be, he uses his official connections to push his way in. This creates issues for two reasons. First, it makes clear that Rabinow has power and is willing to use it to get what he wants, that is, information. Second, he finds himself in the midst of a political conflict he doesn't entirely understand. By drawing on official connections, he has unknowingly chosen sides in an ongoing conflict. Thus, the anthropologist may not always be fully in control of their situation, as the people they're studying have their own agendas independent of the anthropologists. Again, the point is that the people anthropologists study are very different from rocks. Rocks don't have agendas and conflicts, but people do. Next, let's turn to Mekki. Here we see someone who isn't a good informant in the way that Ali is, because he lacks the imaginative ability to study and objectify his own culture. He supplies Rabinow with certain kinds of relatively straightforward information, but he's unable to really reflect on the meanings of his own cultural practices the way Ali can. Informants have different personalities and capabilities. Just because they're from the same culture doesn't mean they are totally the same. So it's important to have a number of informants with different strengths to get a more complete picture of the culture. Let's talk a little bit about Malik. Unlike Ali, Malik is a solid citizen, right in the mainstream of his culture. He's knowledgeable and respected, and thus able to provide lots of information, particularly on straightforward matters like property, genealogy and kinship, and so on. But he doesn't have the same kind of critical perspective as Ali. In providing information to Rabinow, he discovers something about himself that radically alters his own understanding of how he fits into his society. Malik is someone who has always thought of himself as having a tough life, full of struggle and bad luck. But what he discovers in providing economic information to Rabinow is that he is in fact wealthy compared to his fellow villagers. This undermines his own sense of self and forces him to, quote, reformulate his own experience to understand what Rabinow was doing, end quote. As Malik objectified his own life world for Rabinow, he was forced to interpret this life world in a way that he might never have done before. According to Rabinow, ethnographic data is thus doubly interpreted, first by the informant and then by the anthropologist. This is not a straightforward process of gathering data then, but a chain of interpretation that has to be acknowledged and taken into account as anthropologists analyze their data and reach conclusions. Let's turn back to Ali. In this case, we see how anthropologists can manipulate people to get the information they want. This is reminiscent of something we saw with Shagnon and the Yanomamo. Rabinow uses Ali's willingness to tell his version of events during the Sultan's exiles to spur others to tell their stories, which they don't really want to do and only do so reluctantly. Rabinow goes as far as calling this kind of use of manipulation symbolic violence, which is quite a harsh term. This raises, again, some of the ethical issues that field workers face and deal with in the field. Turning now to Rabinow's questions about the village's knowledge of their patron saint's legend. Through the course of conducting fieldwork, Rabinow had demonstrated to the villagers their own ignorance of their saint's legend. In an attempt to reconnect with tradition, they try to conduct a ritual involving the slaughtering of cows, which they bungle terribly. This embarrassing event puts the erosion of the village's cultural identity on display, which they find very upsetting. Again, we see how fieldwork may show things to informants that they wish they might not have learned. It changes informants as well as the anthropologist. Lastly, let's take Rabinow's relationship with Ben Muhammad. Ben Muhammad refuses to be Rabinow's informant. Instead, he wants to be Rabinow's host and his friend. Despite their friendship, Ben Muhammad sticks to his belief that Muslims are superior to non-Muslims. He believes he has not just a different, but a better tradition than Rabinow, who, as he himself admits, has a similar belief about Western and American culture. On page 162, Rabinow writes the following. Ben Muhammad grew up in a historical situation which provided him meaningful but only partially satisfactory interpretations of his world, as did I, or Rabinow. Our otherness was not an ineffable essence, but rather the sum of different historical experiences. Different webs of signification or meaning separated us, but these webs were now partially intertwined. But a dialogue was only possible when we recognized our differences, when we remained critically loyal to the symbols which our traditions had given us. By doing so, we began a process of change. In this quote, we see that both Ben Muhammad and Rabinow are aware of their differences, but still able to understand each other, at least to a certain point. For Rabinow, this is a crucial metaphor for cultural anthropology and fieldwork. It involves trying to intertwine webs of meaning, or what he calls webs of signification. This is possible to a certain extent, but it can never be complete. The fact that cultures are different and that people are loyal to different cultures means they can never be completely transparent to each other, and that people from different cultures may not ever be completely able to understand the other person's point of view. But we can make it part of the way. That's what cultural anthropology and fieldwork has the promise to do. So, let's go back to that definition of fieldwork as a process of intersubjective construction of liminal modes of communication. Let's take it word by word, having gone through the book. Process. As should be apparent, fieldwork unfolds over time and changes as it does. The fieldworker changes and adapts and has no experiences, but informants do too. Intersubjective. Fieldwork involves relations between subjects, not between a subject and an object, as it would in geology, where scientists study rocks. Both fieldworkers and informants have agency and agendas. Thus, establishing relations involves work, that is to say, the construction of liminal modes of communication. Construction takes time and effort to build these relationships and communication that fieldwork require. Culture is not transparent or just sitting there waiting to be understood. It takes work to do field work. Liminal modes of communication. This phrase has to be taken as a whole. Liminal means in between or partial. Mode of communication is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, the anthropologist has to build bridges of communication, a back and forth of understanding between themselves and their research subjects. Putting these two parts of the phrase together, we see that while some common understanding can be achieved, it's never complete. Anthropologists and informants are never completely transparent to each other, fully able to understand each other, or completely knowledgeable of each other. The best we can hope for are those intertwined webs of communication that we touched on above. So there you have it. Fieldwork is a process of intersubjective construction of liminal modes of communication. Another definition to add to the list. Obviously one that is complex and a bit wordy, but one that really gets at the difficulty and the complications inherent in fieldwork. Let's end with some key points. You can pause and read these over for yourself, but I want to highlight one general point that encompasses all these. Both the fieldwork and the informant are changed in the process of fieldwork. This can be dicey, as we have seen, but it encapsulates the highest ambitions of cultural anthropology, not just to learn about quote-unquote other cultures, but by doing so to create lines of communication and connection that might make a better and more united world. This winds up the section of the course related to fieldwork. Over the past few modules, we've learned a number of different ways of conceptualizing fieldwork. As I hope you can see, it's a complex endeavor with strengths and weaknesses. This is an important point moving forward in the class because fieldwork is the most common, though not the only, way in which cultural anthropologists gather data. Most of the articles we have read and will read are based on fieldwork, and a better understanding of the methods upon which they are based will hopefully allow you to both appreciate those articles and the topics they discuss, as well as to think critically about the conclusions and interpretations that they reach. This kind of active engagement is very important to cultural anthropology, as it guards against ethnocentrism and allows for interpretations and conclusions to be challenged and revised as we learn more and as circumstances change. Okay, thanks for your attention, and I'll see you next time.